On 8th of May 1945, the Third Reich officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But for millions of German soldiers, the struggle had only begun. From Soviet labor camps in Siberia to interrogation centers in France, from shattered German cities to distant prison camps, these men faced a post-war ordeal that would last years, sometimes decades. Their story reveals a side of World War II rarely told: what happened to the defeated. In the final days of April 1945, the Wehrmacht was disintegrating. German forces were collapsing on all fronts. In the east, Soviet armies had already entered Berlin. In the west, American and British forces were racing across Germany. Trapped between advancing enemies, millions of German soldiers faced an impossible choice: surrender to the Soviets or flee west toward the Americans and British. The difference between those two options would determine whether a soldier lived or died. Wehrmacht commanders knew what awaited their men in Soviet captivity. Stalin had not forgotten the 27 million Soviet citizens killed during the German invasion. Red Army soldiers had seen the destruction wrought across their homeland. When German soldiers fell into Soviet hands, mercy was rarely extended. On 2nd May 1945, Berlin fell. That same day, tens of thousands of German soldiers attempted to break through Soviet lines to reach the Elbe River, where American forces waited on the western bank. Some succeeded, most did not. The Soviets captured approximately 3 million German soldiers in the final weeks of the war. Another 2 million would be taken in the months that followed, as Red Army units swept through Eastern Europe, rounding up stragglers, deserters, and men trying to blend into civilian populations. Those captured by the Western Allies faced a different fate. Between May and June 1945, American forces alone took custody of over 4 million German soldiers. British and French forces detained millions more. The sheer scale overwhelmed Allied infrastructure. Massive prisoner camps known as Rheinwiesenlager were established along the Rhine River. These were not traditional camps with barracks. They were open fields surrounded by barbed wire, holding hundreds of thousands of men with minimal shelter, insufficient food, and inadequate sanitation. The conditions were brutal. Men slept on bare ground, often without tents or blankets. Rations were meager, sometimes as little as a few hundred calories per day. Dysentery and typhus spread rapidly. Estimates of deaths in these camps vary widely, with some historians suggesting tens of thousands perished during the spring and summer of 1945. Allied commanders, overwhelmed by logistics and focused on feeding liberated populations and their own troops, struggled to provide adequate care for captured enemy soldiers. By late 1945, the Western Allies began releasing prisoners in stages. Those classified as lower risk, men who had served in non-combat roles or who had no affiliation with Nazi Party organizations, were released first. Others remained in custody longer, particularly those suspected of war crimes or membership in the SS. The process was chaotic. Denazification tribunals reviewed individual cases, but the volume of prisoners meant that many spent months or even years waiting for a hearing. For those captured by the Soviets, the experience was far harsher and far longer. The Soviet Union did not view German prisoners as mere military detainees. They were considered tools for reconstruction. Stalin ordered that German POWs be put to work rebuilding the cities, factories, and infrastructure the Wehrmacht had destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were transported deep into the Soviet Union, to labor camps in Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia. The journey alone killed thousands. Men were packed into unheated freight cars during the winter months, traveling for weeks across frozen landscapes. Upon arrival, they were assigned to construction brigades, mining operations, and timber camps. The work was grueling. Temperatures in Siberian camps regularly dropped below -40 degrees Celsius. Rations were tied to productivity. Those who met quotas received slightly more food, while those who fell short faced starvation. Soviet records indicate that approximately 381,000 German POWs died in captivity, though some historians believe the true number was higher. Disease, malnutrition, exposure, and industrial accidents claimed lives at an alarming rate. Survivors later recalled that the first winter was the deadliest. Men who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured the siege of Stalingrad or the retreat from Moscow, died in camps far from any battlefield. Releases from Soviet captivity came slowly. The first group of POWs returned to Germany in 1947, but these were primarily men deemed unfit for labour due to illness or injury. The majority remained in the camps. It was not until 1949, 4 years after the war's end, that the Soviets began releasing prisoners in larger numbers. Even then, tens of thousands remained in captivity. The final group of German POWs did not return from the Soviet Union until 1956, more than a decade after the war had ended. When they arrived in Germany, many found that their families had presumed them dead. Back in Germany, the soldiers who had been released faced a country that barely resembled the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were fields of rubble. The German economy had collapsed. Millions of people were homeless, living in cellars, barracks, or refugee camps. Food was scarce. The black market thrived while official rations provided barely enough to survive. For returning soldiers, reintegration was not straightforward. Many came home to find their houses destroyed, their families displaced, or their spouses remarried, having believed them dead. Veterans carried both physical and psychological scars. Amputations, blindness, and other injuries were common. Post-traumatic stress, though not yet widely recognized or treated, affected countless men who had witnessed or participated in the horrors of the Eastern Front. But beyond personal trauma, returning soldiers faced a society grappling with guilt, shame, and denial. The full scope of Nazi atrocities was becoming public knowledge. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, exposed the systematic nature of the Holocaust and other war crimes. Newsreels showed footage from liberated concentration camps. For ordinary soldiers, the question became unavoidable. What had they known? What had they done? The answers varied. Some soldiers had served on the Western Front and claimed ignorance of the extermination camps in the East. Others had been stationed in occupied territories where they witnessed or participated in reprisals against civilians. Still others had served in units directly involved in atrocities. In post-war Germany, a collective silence emerged. Families did not ask, and veterans did not volunteer information. It would take decades before Germany began confronting this period openly. The Allied occupation authorities implemented denazification programs intended to remove former Nazis from positions of influence and to re-educate the German population. Every adult German was required to fill out a Fragebogen, a questionnaire detailing their activities during the Nazi era. Those who had been members of the Nazi Party, the SS, or other organizations faced tribunals that classified them into categories ranging from major offenders to followers. For soldiers, the denazification process was uneven. Membership in the Wehrmacht alone was not considered criminal, as the Allies distinguished between the regular army and organizations like the SS. However, soldiers who had held ranks in the SS or who were suspected of war crimes faced harsher scrutiny. Thousands were prosecuted in Allied courts. Some were executed. Others received prison sentences that ranged from a few years to life. Yet the denazification program was inconsistent. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans, initially pursued denazification aggressively, but soon shifted focus as Cold War tensions rose. By 1947, rebuilding West Germany as a bulwark against Soviet expansion took priority over punishing former Nazis. Many former soldiers, even those with questionable wartime records, found themselves quietly integrated into the new West German government, police forces, and intelligence agencies. In East Germany, under Soviet control, the approach was different. The communist government portrayed itself as the anti-fascist state and claimed that former Nazis had fled to the West. In reality, East Germany also employed former Wehrmacht officers and officials, particularly in technical and administrative roles. The narrative of collective guilt was rejected in favor of blaming a small circle of capitalist elites for the war. The economic recovery of West Germany, known as the Wirtschaftswunder or economic miracle, began in the late 1940s and accelerated through the 1950s. The Marshall Plan provided crucial aid. Currency reform in 1948 stabilized the economy. Factories were rebuilt, jobs became available. For many returning soldiers, the focus shifted from the past to survival and rebuilding. Veterans organizations formed to provide support and advocate for benefits. The most controversial of these was HIAG. the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der ehemaligen Angehörigen der Waffen-SS, a mutual aid organization for former Waffen-SS members. HIAG claimed to be a welfare organization, but it also worked to rehabilitate the image of the Waffen-SS, arguing that its members had been soldiers like any others and should not be collectively blamed for war crimes. Critics accused HIAG of whitewashing history and providing cover for unrepentant Nazis. By the 1950s, West Germany passed laws providing pensions for war veterans, including those who had served in the Wehrmacht. These pensions became a contentious issue as victims of the Nazi regime and their families questioned why men who had fought for Hitler were receiving state benefits, while compensation for Holocaust survivors and forced labourers lagged behind. The German government argued that the pensions were intended to support men who had been conscripted and had fought for their country regardless of the regime they had served. For decades, German veterans maintained a version of history that emphasized their own suffering, while downplaying or ignoring the broader context of the war. Memoirs published in the 1950s and 1960s often portrayed the Wehrmacht as a professional, honorable military force that had been manipulated by Nazi leadership. This narrative, known as the clean Wehrmacht myth, suggested that ordinary soldiers had no involvement in atrocities and had simply been doing their duty. This myth persisted for decades, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Historians later demonstrated that Wehrmacht units had participated extensively in war crimes, including mass executions of civilians, the murder of Soviet POWs, and logistical support for the Holocaust. The myth began to crumble in the 1990s when a travelling exhibition, War of Extermination, Crimes of the Wehrmacht 1941-1944, presented photographs and documents showing Wehrmacht involvement in atrocities. The exhibition sparked fierce debate in Germany, with veterans groups protesting while younger generations demanded a more honest reckoning with the past. As the decades passed, the generation that had fought in the war began to age and die. In the 1980s and 1990s, some veterans broke their silence and spoke openly about what they had seen and done. Others took their stories to the grave. Interviews conducted with elderly veterans revealed a spectrum of responses. Some expressed remorse. Others defended their actions or claimed they had no choice. A few remained unrepentant, insisting they had fought for Germany, not for Nazism. The question of guilt and responsibility extended beyond individual soldiers to broader questions about collective memory. How should post-war Germany remember its soldiers? Were they victims of a totalitarian regime, or were they complicit in its crimes? The answer, historians now agree, is that both can be true. Conscription was widespread, and many young men had little choice but to serve. Yet, service in the Wehrmacht did not absolve individuals of responsibility for their actions. The line between victim and perpetrator was often blurred, and each case required individual examination. The fate of German soldiers also depended heavily on where they were captured and what role they had played. Those captured by Western forces in the final weeks of the war were generally released within a few years. Those taken by the Soviets faced a decade or more of forced labour. Soldiers who had served in combat units on the Eastern Front experienced unimaginable brutality, both inflicted and endured. Those who had served in rear areas or administrative roles often returned to normal lives relatively quickly. One lesser-known aspect of the post-war period was the fate of German soldiers who had been captured earlier in the war and held in camps far from Europe. Tens of thousands of German POWs were held in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. These men worked on farms, in factories, and on infrastructure projects. After the war ended, they were gradually repatriated. Some, however, chose not to return. They had formed relationships, started families, or simply saw no future in a devastated Germany. These men became part of the post-war diaspora, living out their lives in the countries that had once been their enemies. Another overlooked group were the so-called Heimkehrer, the men who returned from Soviet captivity in the 1950s. By the time they arrived in West Germany, they were strangers in their own land. The country had moved on. Their families had rebuilt their lives. The returning POWs struggled with physical and psychological damage from years of harsh labour, and they often felt alienated from a society that preferred not to dwell on the war. The German government eventually established programs to assist these men, but the support was limited. Many Heimkehrer suffered from what would now be recognized as PTSD, but mental health care for veterans was rudimentary at best. The cultural expectation was that men should stoically endure their trauma and reintegrate into society without complaint. Those who could not adjust often turned to alcohol or withdrew into isolation. For German soldiers captured by other nations, experiences varied widely. French captivity was notoriously harsh in the immediate aftermath of the war. France had suffered under German occupation, and French authorities were in no mood to extend courtesies to captured enemy soldiers. German POWs were used as forced labour to clear mines, rebuild infrastructure, and work in agriculture. Conditions were grim, and many men died before France began releasing prisoners in 1948 and 1949. In contrast, German soldiers held by the British generally fared better, though conditions were far from comfortable. British camps were overcrowded, but rations were more adequate than in French or Soviet facilities. The British also began using German POWs as labourers, particularly in agriculture, where wartime conscription had created severe labour shortages. Some German POWs remained in Britain until 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects before being repatriated. One of the most controversial aspects of the post-war treatment of German soldiers involved the policy of forced repatriation. Under agreements made at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allies agreed to return all Soviet citizens captured in German-held territory to the Soviet Union. This policy was intended to reunite displaced persons with their homelands, but it had tragic consequences for some groups. Among the prisoners returned to the Soviet Union were not only Soviet citizens who had been forced labourers in Germany, but also soldiers who had been captured by the Germans and subsequently joined anti-Soviet forces, such as the Russian Liberation Army led by General Andrei Vlasov. These men, often referred to as Vlasov's army, had fought alongside the Germans against the Soviets, viewing Stalin's regime as their true enemy. When the war ended, they hoped to find refuge in the West. Instead, the Western Allies handed them over to Soviet authorities, where most were executed or sent to the Gulag. German soldiers who had collaborated with these anti-Soviet forces sometimes found themselves caught in this forced repatriation as well. The Allies initially struggled to distinguish between German nationals and ethnic Germans from the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe who had served in the Wehrmacht. The process was often arbitrary and chaotic, leading to cases where men were sent to the wrong country or handed over to hostile authorities. By the mid-1950s, the question of war guilt and justice had grown more complicated. West Germany had been admitted to NATO in 1955, and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government sought to present a new democratic Germany to the world. At the same time, many former Wehrmacht officers and soldiers held positions in the newly formed Bundeswehr, West Germany's military. This created a tension. How could Germany reconcile its past with its present? Adenauer's government adopted a policy of limited accountability. High-ranking Nazi officials and those directly implicated in war crimes were prosecuted, but the vast majority of former soldiers were allowed to reintegrate without facing legal consequences. This pragmatic approach was driven by political necessity. West Germany needed stability, and pursuing every individual who had served in the Wehrmacht would have been both logistically impossible and politically destabilizing. In East Germany, the situation was different. The communist government claimed to have thoroughly purged fascist elements from society, though in practice, many former Nazis quietly assumed roles in the state apparatus. The official narrative emphasized collective innocence for the working class, who had supposedly been misled by capitalist warmongers. Veterans were rarely discussed publicly, and those who had fought for the Wehrmacht were expected to remain silent about their service. As Germany entered the 1960s and 1970s, a new generation came of age that had no direct memory of the war. These young Germans began asking uncomfortable questions about what their parents and grandparents had done. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, held between 1963 and 1965, brought renewed attention to the Holocaust and the complicity of ordinary Germans. The trials prosecuted personnel from the Auschwitz concentration camp, and testimonies revealed the systematic nature of the extermination process. The generational divide deepened. Veterans who had kept silent for decades found themselves confronted by children and grandchildren who demanded answers. Some families fractured over these conversations. Others never had them at all, maintaining a wall of silence that persisted for decades. The question of what ordinary soldiers had known and done became a central issue in Germany's long reckoning with its past. One significant development in the 1980s was the work of historians who began systematically studying the Wehrmacht's role in war crimes. Using newly accessible archives and survivor testimonies, researchers demonstrated that the distinction between the clean Wehrmacht and the criminal SS was largely a myth. Wehrmacht units had participated in mass executions, facilitated the Holocaust, and committed widespread atrocities in occupied territories. This research culminated in the controversial 1995 exhibition mentioned earlier. The backlash from veterans groups was intense. Many former soldiers insisted that they had fought honourably, and that the exhibition unfairly tarnished the memory of millions who had simply done their duty. Younger Germans, however, saw the exhibition as a necessary confrontation with historical truth. The debate revealed how deeply conflicted German society remained about the war, even 50 years after its end. As the 21st century began, the last generation of Wehrmacht veterans entered old age. Oral history projects raced to record their testimonies before they passed away. What emerged from these interviews was a complex picture. Some veterans expressed profound regret and acknowledged their role in a criminal war. Others remained defensive, clinging to narratives of victimhood or duty. A few admitted to specific atrocities, while many claimed ignorance or insisted that they had seen nothing. The physical toll of the war on these men was evident. Many carried injuries sustained decades earlier. Others bore the psychological scars of combat, captivity, or moral complicity. The final years of this generation were marked by a gradual passing, with obituaries and memorials that often glossed over the darker aspects of their service. By 2010, the number of living Wehrmacht veterans had dwindled to a few thousand. Museums and memorial sites began preserving their stories, both as historical records and as cautionary tales. The question of how to remember these men remained contentious. Were they soldiers who fought for their country, or were they participants in one of history's greatest crimes? The answer for most historians is that they were both. The children and grandchildren of German soldiers have also grappled with this legacy. Many have written memoirs, produced documentaries, or participated in reconciliation projects. Some have travelled to the sites where their fathers or grandfathers fought, seeking to understand what happened. Others have chosen to distance themselves from the past entirely. One notable case is that of Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the Nazi Governor-General of occupied Poland. Nicholas spent his life publicly condemning his father and rejecting the idea that soldiers and officials of the Third Reich were simply following orders. His stance contrasts sharply with others, like Edda Göring, who defended her father Hermann Göring until her death. The legacy of German soldiers after World War II is inseparable from the broader legacy of Nazism and the Holocaust. Unlike veterans of other conflicts, German soldiers of the Second World War could not be universally honoured without confronting the nature of the regime they had served. This reality shaped how Germany approached memorialization, education, and historical memory. Today, Germany has no national memorial to Wehrmacht soldiers. There are local memorials, often controversial, and private cemeteries where families remember their dead. But the state has consciously avoided creating monuments that might be interpreted as glorifying the Wehrmacht. This stands in stark contrast to other nations, where war memorials honour all who served, regardless of the war's outcome or morality. The treatment of German soldiers after World War II also had international dimensions. Countries that had been occupied by Germany wrestled with their own complicated feelings toward German veterans. In France, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Soviet Union, the memory of occupation, resistance, and collaboration shaped how German soldiers were perceived for decades. In France, the Netherlands, Poland, and the Soviet Union, the memory of occupation, resistance, and collaboration shaped how German soldiers were perceived for decades. Some former enemies eventually found reconciliation. The Treaty of Élysée in 1963 between France and West Germany symbolized the two nations moving past their wartime enmity. Veterans groups from both sides occasionally met, though such meetings were rare and often fraught with tension. Apologies were offered, sometimes accepted, sometimes not. In Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the wounds remained deeper. The scale of destruction and loss during the German invasion left scars that would take generations to heal. Even today, references to the Great Patriotic War dominate Russian historical memory, and German soldiers are remembered almost exclusively as invaders and war criminals. The post-war experience also differed for soldiers based on their rank and role. Officers generally faced more intense scrutiny during denazification, as they were presumed to have had greater agency and responsibility. Many high-ranking officers were held for years while their cases were reviewed. Some were prosecuted for specific war crimes. Others were eventually released without charges but faced restrictions on employment and movement. Enlisted men, particularly those who had been conscripted rather than volunteering, often passed through denazification more quickly. The Allies recognized that many young German soldiers had little choice in their service and had not been in positions to make significant decisions. This pragmatic approach allowed millions of men to reintegrate relatively quickly, though they still faced the broader challenges of living in a devastated country. The experience of soldiers captured during the Battle of Stalingrad illustrated the extremes of the PW experience. Between November 1942 and February 1943, the Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed in the city. Of the approximately 110,000 German soldiers who surrendered when the battle ended, only about 6,000 would ever see Germany again. These survivors faced conditions that tested human endurance. After surrendering, they were marched through the frozen steppe, often without adequate clothing or food. Many collapsed and died on these marches. The few who survived Stalingrad captivity did not return until the mid-1950s. When they finally arrived in Germany, they were skeletal, broken men who had lost more than a decade of their lives. Their testimonies provided some of the most harrowing accounts of the POW experience, and their stories became part of the collective memory of German suffering during the war. The integration of former soldiers into civilian life also varied by occupation zone. In the Soviet zone, which became East Germany, veterans faced suspicion and surveillance. The communist government viewed former Wehrmacht soldiers as potentially reactionary and unreliable. Many were excluded from positions of authority in government, education, or industry. Those who had served as officers or in the SS faced particular discrimination, often relegated to manual labor or menial jobs. In the Western zones, which became West Germany, the approach was more lenient. Former soldiers were generally allowed to pursue careers based on their skills and education, provided they passed denazification proceedings. This meant that many veterans were able to resume professional lives relatively quickly. Engineers, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals often returned to their fields within a few years of the war's end. The economic recovery of the 1950s created opportunities for veterans to rebuild their lives materially. Jobs became abundant as the German economy surged. Wages rose and living standards improved dramatically. For many veterans, the economic miracle provided a way to move forward and focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. The prosperity of the post-war decades allowed many Germans to avoid confronting difficult questions about the war and their role in it. The question of whether justice could be served so late divided opinion. Survivors and their families argued that age should not be a shield against accountability. Defense attorneys countered that prosecuting men in failing health for actions taken as teenagers or young adults was neither just nor practical. Courts generally sided with prosecution, ruling that the severity of the crimes outweighed concerns about the defendant's age. As the last survivors of World War II pass away, the story of what happened to German soldiers transitions from living memory to history. The debates over their guilt, their suffering, and their legacy will continue, but without the voices of those who lived it. This shift marks the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in how the war is remembered. For the millions of German soldiers who survived the war, the post-war years were defined by a struggle to rebuild lives in a country that had been destroyed physically, morally, and politically. Some succeeded, finding work, raising families, and integrating into the new Germany. Others never recovered, haunted by what they had witnessed or done. All lived with the knowledge that they had served a regime responsible for unprecedented atrocities. Their story is not one of simple victimhood or villainy. It is a story of ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, some of whom committed terrible acts, others who witnessed them and still others who claimed ignorance. It is a story of survival, guilt, denial, and in rare cases, genuine remorse. It is a story that Germany continues to grapple with, even now, 80 years after the war's end. The legacy of these soldiers is a reminder that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield. For German soldiers, the end of the war did not bring peace. It brought interrogation, imprisonment, forced labor, and a return to a country that no longer existed as they had known it. It brought the slow, painful realization of what had been done in their name, and the equally painful question of what they themselves had done. Their children and grandchildren inherited this burden, and they have responded in different ways. Some have sought to uncover the truth, others to defend their forebears, and still others to move forward without looking back. But the past is not easily escaped, and the shadow of the second. World War continues to shape German identity, politics, and memory. What happened to German soldiers after World War II is ultimately a question about accountability, memory, and the long aftermath of catastrophic war. It is a question without simple answers, and one that each generation must confront anew. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Heinrich Himmler's Family After WW2 next. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more historic weirdos. Thanks for watching.